So I think we need to really talk about these issues. It's high time that we start having very honest conversations. So I'm going to ask our listeners to jot down any questions that they have on our various platforms. This is going to be posted on YouTube and also on the Africa iShare platform, our Facebook page, our LinkedIn page. Please listen through this. Tell us your thoughts. Any other questions that you might have, follow-up questions would be very much appreciated. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Africa iShare, the Africa We Want podcast. And today we are going to be talking about opposition leadership in Africa. Today we are joined by Prosper, who is a very good friend of mine. I'm going to ask Prosper to introduce himself. And then also Christine is on the call, the usual Christine. So Prosper, can you just introduce yourself to the listeners, your name, what you do? Yeah, just that.
Thank you, Chido. Hello, everyone. My name is, I'd like to begin with my surname because that's the one I love. So my name is Zimbi, Prosper Zimbi. I'm a human resources practitioner in Zimbabwe, but with a bias towards psychometrics and like vast interest in politics. So I'm almost always talking or doing or writing about politics if I'm not doing what I get paid to do, which is talent management. I'm glad to be here. I hope I'm going to have fun for the next 30 minutes.
Welcome, Prosper, to the podcast session. Christine, do you want to say hi to people?
Yes, Chido. Hi, everyone, and it's nice to be here this week recording the podcast. We thank you for listening in, and we hope to have a nice discussion.
Okay. So I'm just going to give maybe a brief background as to why we decided to have this conversation today. So, well, obviously, I mean, I don't know if you're aware, there was an election in Zambia, and the newly elected president is actually from an opposition party. And then I think about last year, there was also an election in Malawi, and there was a high court decision that actually declared the opposition leader as being the guy who had won the election. So it's something that is not very common, I would say, in African countries where we have got opposition leaders actually winning elections and getting into power. We know of a lot of other countries where, there has been claims of the ruling government rigging elections, trying to hold on to power. So today we just want to make an analysis of opposition leadership in Africa. The question being, do we really have opposition leadership in most African countries? And second of all, do we think that they are actually the answer to some of the problems that we have? Maybe just to give you a bit appraisal of Prosper, we have had a lot of conversations on this platform, and it seems as if the overarching argument really from every African country's perspective is that some of the problems that we have, they could be economic, they could be socio-economic problems, they all come back from questionable leadership or decisions that are made by our leaders generally. So the question now specifically for this podcast session is, to what extent do we think that the situation could be different or better if we have got the contesting opposition leaders in power? And I think the Malawian situation is a very interesting one for me because, well, they've got someone who was once an opposition leader who's actually now in power. And the question is, are they doing any better than their predecessors? So before I really, get into how I feel about this situation, I'm just going to ask Prosper to, share your mind.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chido. These are interesting questions, the questions that you posed, but so that we keep our time well managed. And let me get straight into Malawi. The interesting thing about Malawi is that the Malawi Congress Party, which is led by His Excellency President Lazarus Chakwera, there's only been opposition for almost 28 years. They've only been opposition since 1994 when Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda lost an election. It's the first time a ruling party in Malawi, the ruling party in Malawi lost. They've been a ruling party since independence, and they lost the 1994 election, and they've been losing since then until Lazarus Chakwera was declared a winner by the Constitutional Court in April of 2020. So this is why it's interesting. We don't get a lot of situations in Africa where the actual opposition, which is what we want to talk about today, they've been a ruling party before. But I don't think from what has happened in Malawi now that there's a lot of difference from the former government and the Chakwera-led government, particularly because I think this is a unique situation, the Malawi one, because Chakwera is not like any other opposition leader, like I said. He's just basically going back to the ideology of the liberation struggle. Probably not in the strict sense, but he has already started speaking like recently because of the trip that he did to the United Kingdom, and he was grilled on the BBC Hard Talk about why he brought family as part of his delegation. After that, he's on record recently for having said we shouldn't allow anyone other than ourselves to tell us who to take on foreign trips or tell us anything at all about African governance. So this is a person starting to sound like Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, like the late President Robert Mugabe. This is the kind of opposition leader that the people that control Britain's institutions, the people that control all the neoliberalist policies that world trade is running on, do not want to see in power. People don't want a Robert Mugabe. People don't want a Muammar Gaddafi. Not that these are bad for Africans, but because these are bad for neoliberalism. And so the West doesn't like that. So you won't find a Lazarus Chakwera government succeeding as much as maybe from what we've seen in the last few days that Hakainde Hichilema as the president-elect is likely to succeed. He has more enemies than any other opposition leader would have in Africa, because even the West is fighting him because he's becoming a socialist and they don't like socialism.
That's very interesting. I actually had no idea that the current president in Malawi was, part of what we call liberation war struggle parties. I'm going to ask Christine a little bit. I think Kenya, the Kenyan political history is also very interesting. You guys have had a change of presidents, if I'm not mistaken. Do you have any views on that?
Okay. So in the Kenya scenario, there's quite a bit that can be said, because there was a ruling president who was for a long time, like just as many African countries, you find that a president is incumbent for a number of years. Then in the election of 2002, there was a big change where what had been the ruling party for years was changed, and now the opposition came into leadership. And then there was such positivity, of course, as new leaders come in, there's a lot of positivity. But then the thing with Kenyan politics, unlike or opposition parties and the political parties, is that they change shape, they change names, they change. So the alliances change. So like the people who came into power in 2002, by the time and the president then we have 5-year terms that a president can serve. So within after the 10 years, the party that was the ruling party then was, lost. Politicians moved out of that party. So now what happened is that the party was left almost as a skeleton. And then now new parties are formed. So you'll find that it's only when there was an enactment of to regulate like how people conduct themselves in the political parties that quite a bit has changed. But what politicians would do is that you go be elected in one party, go change from that party when you are in the house, and then you can change as many times as possible. And then now what that meant is that there were short-term parties, so that you can never quite say get a track record of the party that was formed in 2002 and the opposition and today, like where are they? And then the other thing that happens is that politicians, they crisscross sides. So like the most interesting scenario, of course there has been a lot that has happened between those years, but like in 2018, 2017, 2018, there's an election that was quite much disputed, and now what happened was that the opposition party and the the incumbent president who was in a different party had to actually explain. They had what is called the handshake. So what the handshake meant is that because they were fighting, because the opposition then, what they said was that they won the election, but it was rigged. But then now what the president then did is that they tried to have an agreement, a sort of a working arrangement where the two parties can work together. Ideally, what that meant is that the opposition was taken out, so that now the opposition almost now joined the ruling party, and now that has been quite a situation, Chido. And until right now, even it's not very clear. Politicians being politicians, like someone supports the president, the next time they don't support the president and such things. And then as that, actually, this is quite an interesting time because there was the president and the opposition leader who they had the handshake, which is a common saying in Kenya. They were trying then to have the constitution changed and to have a referendum. And it's what is called the BBI. It's been trending on Twitter in the last couple of days because the Court of Appeal said that what they were seeking to amend the constitution, that it's illegal, it's unlawful. So the case was lost at the Court of Appeal, which is people are very pleased about it because again, it's politicians pushing for the constitution to be amended and to especially to favor those who will be ruling. But the situation, as I'm saying, is it's not clear cut as you'd say that there's like the US, there's always the Democrats and the Republicans, and people have like strong feelings and alliances. In Kenya, that's not the case. The opposition crosses over to the ruling party based on what you can get for the 5 or 10 years. And then, as at now, it's unclear who the opposition is. I mean, the opposition is always, almost like always, the person who disagrees with the current president at the moment. So it's that sort of thing, Chido.
Wow. That's just something else. So, Prosper, I'll obviously ask you in your remarks to comment on what Christine has said. And obviously, I would want you to comment on the recent events in Zambia and because I mean, the whole idea that an opposition leader has won an election, it has sort of given hopes to a lot of other, Africans. I can give an example of our fellow countrymen, Zimbabweans, who are obviously so ecstatic and thinking that the change is near in most African countries. What do you think of the Zambian situation? Do you think that the government now or the elected government is going to be, different from what has been happening? Do you think that there is something to be ecstatic about? Are you being enthusiastic about I just want to get how you feel, and obviously comment on the Kenyan situation.
Okay, thank you, Chido. I'll start with the latter question and then the Kenyan situation. The Zambian situation is really interesting, but before I say a lot about it, I want to begin by saying the man who has not been inaugurated as the president of Zambia yet, and yet, just because presumably he is president-elect, the Zambian kwacha gained against the US dollar recently, quite a few days ago, making it the best performing currency against the US dollar, which is interesting. So you'd understand people like the neighbors, Zimbabwe, being ecstatic, having that kind of euphoria because of the kind of history that Zimbabweans have with their currency. You know how Zimbabwe ended up having like a terrible currency to the extent that they had to slash zeros a number of times. But also it's interesting how on a general level they are interpreting this as something that means change can come in their next harmonized elections, which are in 2023. I saw someone on Twitter say the Federation of Rhodesia in Nyasaland 2/3 complete, meaning to say Malawi, formerly known as Nyasaland, an opposition party won, Northern Rhodesia, present-day Zambia, an opposition party won. So the thinking is coming to Zimbabwe. But I personally don't think things are in black and white like that. Like I don't think it automatically means that there's a wave of opposition parties winning, because I think that there are some fundamental differences in these countries, which maybe the average person would know. But let me try and run it down quick. First of all, let's speak about how Hakainde Hichilema, the Zambian president, has come into power. He obviously has come into power on the backdrop of very high rates of youth unemployment, a, let's call it failing, for lack of a better term, a failing economy, because in the last 2 years, the Zambian kwacha had struggled. It moved from around 1 is to 14 with the years to around 1 is to 22, and then stabilized. And then towards election time, it started fluctuating. It would rise and it would fall. But I think it was generally just economic issues. So those being economic issues, and the current president-elect selling them a Donald Trump, by which I mean this guy is the second largest cattle rancher in Zambia. He's very millionaire, probably the richest man in Zambia, according to some BBC article from a week ago, I think. So this is a guy that goes to them and does what I've written sometime in my blog, that what he did is called land victory, by which I mean before he became the richest man in Zambia, he came from humble beginning. So then he goes to the people complaining about economics, and then he goes and sells a picture that he's like them because he knows what it's like. But he also tells them, but no, I became a successful business. So what I did with myself, I can do with the economy of Zambia. And this is why he gets voted in. It might sound exactly the same like the Zimbabwean story, but why I don't think the Zimbabwean story is the same is because the Zimbabwean story is one way even people that voted for the opposition, I think maybe let's call it the most popular opposition political party, is president, are starting to lose faith. Now we are used to a polarized Zimbabwe where it's ZANU-PF versus the MDC, called the MDC Alliance for now. But now it's not just only ZANU-PF versus MDC. It's everyone fighting everyone. The ZANU-PF obviously is fighting, but you have the MDC Alliance fighting on their own. You have people trying to oust the sitting opposition sitting president in the party. You have people thinking that he has no plan. So because people are disgruntled and the party is divided in itself, these are things that we can't just ignore. These are things that show us that it doesn't mean that victory in Zambia will directly translate to victory in Zimbabwe. And I think, frankly, the monopoly of the apparatus of state, let's call it state violence for lack of a better word. These dynamics are different in Zimbabwe than the Zambia. The army in Zimbabwe has been constantly involved in national politics from pre-colonial, just after post-colonial times. You remember General Vitalis Shinarashi saying that even if they lost an election to Morgan Tsvangirai, he hadn't gone to war. So they weren't just going to let the country go with a sellout. We had this almost the same situation with General Chiwenga when Morgan Tsvangirai apparently won an election, but not with the 50+1 constitutionally required for him to be president. And we had almost recently the same thing is being mentioned now. You don't get all of these things in Zambia. So because you cannot separate the ruling party in Zimbabwe and the major apparatus of violence, this is something that's different. For example, I can tell you for a fact in 2017, the current president-elect was invited to the national broadcasters at NBC to be aired. We don't in Zimbabwe, you don't find an opposition political leader, a serious opposition political leader being invited to the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation to air his views. We have a multi-party democracy that is more complicated than any other multi-party democracy in SADC and in Africa as a whole. So I personally don't think that what happened in Zambia means automatically that it's going to translate to Zimbabwe. But I can understand the euphoria of people that do not understand or that don't support the ruling party. And then the Kenyan situation is a pretty interesting one as well. But what I want to say, I'm not particularly able to point out Kenya in and of itself, but I just want to make a blanket statement on ideology, but in the context of Kenya. I think what most people don't realize is that politics in Africa has two sides which cannot be ignored. First of all, the politicians, most of them are obviously like any other politician in it for the money, the power, and the influence. So like Christine was saying, if a president loses, he's likely to be ditched and people will move from one political party to another. So that's because it's about money. But then there are those, especially the founding fathers of these countries and the founding fathers of ruling political parties, liberation war political parties. when they started these things, it was based on an ideology. At that particular time, it was as simple as socialism versus capitalism. They still hold those values and those principles dear. And the reason why those principles are not easy to do away with is because Africa is always coming from a point where they are trying to fight capitalism, whether or not we know it. We are coming from a point where we are trying to say we want to be recognized. We don't like how you are making us cheap labor. We don't like you taking our resources from us and processing them elsewhere and then bringing them here and selling them to us. We don't like that. We don't have enough recognition and respect in the United Nations, things like that. So it's easy for socialist populist rhetoric to sustain a ruling party in and of itself than it is for an opposition political party trying to sell capitalism in neoliberalist tendencies, which at face value look like, oh, well, we are for the people. We think we want a democracy. We want equal rights for everyone. We need civil rights. We need equitable distribution of wealth, even if that's not what they mean. So it's very difficult then for neoliberalist populist rhetoric to sustain an opposition party to the extent that it can even unseat a ruling party. But it's easier for socialist populist rhetoric because the relationship, there's an umbilical cord between these liberation war parties and the people because of that understanding that we've always been fighting for these things. Yes, we're human, we err, but ultimately and fundamentally, what we want is what we went to war for. It is easier for them to trust liberation war politicians. And then in conclusion, maybe I just want to point out something interesting. There was a survey in 2014, 2015, thereabout, by Afrobarometer on why opposition political parties in Southern Africa struggled to win power. So some of the reasons, according to that survey, were that there was very low trust. That they found out that people generally don't trust opposition political parties as much as they trust liberation war political parties, right? The ruling party. This is particularly because of that relationship. This is not what the survey said. But then I then inferred it to say it's because of the relationship that was created during liberation war times. So then it makes socialist populist rhetoric easy. For example, what we call in Zimbabwe, the land reform program. It became very easy for ZANU-PF to neutralize at that time the threat that had come from the newly formed NDC after ZANU-PF had lost the constitutional referendum of 2002. Because Robert Mugabe simply had to say, we went to war to get our land back, and we haven't been getting our land back. This is why you think we're bad people, as Morgan Changirai is saying. But we're not bad people. So what we're going to do is we're going to get our land back. And it was that easy. And ZANU-PF survived until 2008 when they actually then lost that election. So I think what's happening in Kenya is basically what's happening all over Africa, where the problem generally is that there is more trust between the people in liberation war political parties because of the relationship that was created during the liberation war than it is for these other guys.
Wow, thank you so much for that. Christine, I don't know if you've got any comments on the Zambian situation or generally opposition leadership in Africa, because I think the next round of question is going to be based on the concept of democracy. I'm very much interested in picking up your minds, the two of you, on this aspect of democracy, right? What's really democracy and what actually works for Africa? The reason why I'm asking this is we've got what I would call maybe the European version of it or the American version of it. And then we've got China, that's generally not a democratic society, but seems to be doing well in terms of, economics and like the socio-economic aspects of life. So I want to ask, because it almost feels like, in every other African country, we're trying to pursue that vision of democracy, right? And when we say that, when we start talking about some of the most democratic societies in the continent, we talk about South Africa, right? Because, over and above, the election processes and all that, you have got leaders like Julius Malema being able to stand up and speak their minds in public, in parliament and all these other things. And we think that it's a transformative democracy, or their constitution is progressive enough to allow for constitutional democracy, right? And then we've got obviously other nations within the continent feeling like they've got their right to democracy being infringed upon by ruling parties because they don't get to experience that. So my question is, what actually is democracy in the context of Africa? What works for Africa? Should we really pursue this version of democracy? Do we need to tailor make it to suit, our historical background and all these other issues that we're talking about today? Or we might as well, talk about, how China is doing it, one party states, all these other issues. Do we really think that we need opposition parties? Do we need, opposition? How is it helping? Because my understanding is opposition is supposed to also help with accountability, right? The ruling party needs somebody to hold them accountable. It could be the opposition leadership. It could actually be the very people within the country. But from my perspective, I don't think most opposition parties are actually living to that expectation. And that is why you find that, set aside, rigging and fair elections, some opposition leaders just do not win because people have no faith in them. Yes, it could be this attachment that Prosper speaks of how people are generally attached to the ruling parties, mainly because of the, liberation war struggles and all these other things. But personally, I feel like it goes over and beyond that. The opposition parties in most countries are not performing to our expectations. It could be me, and I love to be wrong. So I've raised, I know, open-ended questions on a lot of these things so that I give you and where you think you might want to attack this whole concept from. So I don't know, Christine.
Okay, Chido, thanks for those observations, and I have a few comments to make. So, in the Kenya scenario, it's not that the opposition cannot speak. I mean, there's no gag to the media or what the opposition can do. It's quite a lot like South Africa in the sense that the opposition is not, you not be arrested or anything done to you because you're in the opposition and you want to speak your mind. That you can do. But I think where the situation comes in, and even as you speak about China, China is almost like a socialist, capitalist, dictatorship kind of situation. And as I was saying, you see that right now, I'm not sure even there has been any strong opposition over the last since the last election, because you see the opposition leader and the ruling and the president now had the handshake where they now agreed to work together. So when you think about it, if the opposition and the ruling party are working together, then there's no opposition, like in real sense. So that's the observation. So I mean, we may just want to say that there's an opposition, but at the end of the day, as you're saying, Chido, I don't think the opposition ever quite does what it should do, especially holding accountability. And I think the thing is, even the opposition side, once they are given even a little bit of power, as Prosper was saying, they will take it and they will desert the duties that they would have as an opposition party, because African politics is about power and it's about money. It's really, I don't think about leadership. So where you can make the money quickest, which is by maybe working with the president, then that's what you do. You just, because being the opposition party is an unpaid job. And then the thing is also with Kenya, it's very capitalistic. It's a very capitalistic society, and I don't think, I think the politics here, it's not even about the liberation party versus a different party. A lot of politics in Kenya is tribal. So people have alliances that just like, and the politicians just play around with the tribe you're from, and so these tribes are pitched against the other tribe, and that's whenever the election is coming up, that's what happens. But then I think to answer your question, Chido, about democracy, in honesty, I think we should have a different discussion like we've had in the past, where it has been suggested that Africa is, we should not be trying to come up with the concept, to take the concept of democracy. We should come up with a system that works for us. So we should evaluate and see, where did the concept of democracy come from? How has it benefited Africa? What has been going on since we decided that we want to be democratic? What really has been the gain? And then I think of greater concern, which I think will be really what might push us to a real democracy, is if politics are based on ideologies. So that you see, again, like the example of the US, there's what Republicans stand for, there's what the Democrats stand for. It's an ideology, it's a notion, it's a concept of what the party stands for, and you align your policies in line with what you stand for. when you look like at politics, actually most African countries, it's not based on ideology. There's a lot of psychophancy and there's a lot of, like euphoria. But ideology, no. That's why no one will actually that's why the opposition cannot be strong, because you need ideologies to say this is what we stand for as the opposition, and this is what our ideas are. And if we ever come to power, we'll stick to the script. Within Africa, there's no script. So that script changes can be written. In fact, it can be thrown away. So because it anyway doesn't exist. So the few things that you may put in your manifesto, you can ignore them completely, because it's not a document that's supposed to serve for a lifetime. It's not yeah, it's just something that someone comes up with for the election period, then you can throw it away shortly after. So there's no strong ideologies aligned to the political parties which could make them hold each other accountable. So, Chido, those are my comments. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Christine. Prosper, please.
Okay, thank you. So the three things quickly. First, I want to speak about why I think that this model of democracy that is being prescribed to Africa doesn't work. So I'll start with Socrates general. Democracy as we know it today, it is funny because if you say democracy, people will start thinking of the United States, particularly because the United States has created an illusion that it is the champion of democracy. And as a result, it started playing like a big brother role, telling everyone what to do and what not to do. Democracy is this, but it is not that. You can do this, but you can't do that. And they are busy basically doing the exact opposite in their own country. But the truth is, I don't know how they managed to like change your perception for them to be identified with democracy when like it is common cause that democracy is like a Greek thing. Okay, it's a thing out of Athens. But the Greeks are respected really politically and academically and civilization and stuff. But there's one philosopher that people always ignore. Socrates was always from the word go until he actually got executed for was against democracy. Now, Socrates' problem with democracy was this, that countries generally, states rather, but like states can't be run based on democracy. Why? Because it is not everyone who is equipped to then choose who should be in leadership and why they should be in leadership. He gave an example, and he says, if you were at sea and you are sailing, right, who would you want to be in charge of controlling the ship? Would you want just any person on that ship, or would you want somebody who is basically trained for that particular job? And then he also says, think about it. If there was in a democracy, right, as we know it, if there was a doctor and a person who like makes and sells sweets, and they were supposed to campaign in front of the crowd, and then the sweet maker says, well, I give you sweets and make your life good because sweets are nice, but this guy, the doctor, is problematic. This is why it's good for me, because he gives you bitter medicine and gives you painful injections, and he lies to you that is for your own health. Then he says, consider what the doctor would say. Would the doctor go to the crowd and say, I actually do those things to you, give you bitter medicine and painful injection for your own good? Because if he did that, the crowd would be at his throat. The crowd would stone him to death. But so what he was saying is basically that democracy leads to demagoguery. Democracy, the actual Greek democracy, leads to demagoguery. You have like populists coming, selling new dreams, and then they take you to a completely terrible direction, which only serves themselves and no one else. Right? But so when that happens, it simply means whoever is in power, no matter how good they are, this is my second point, it then distracts them from doing what they're supposed to do. I want to give an example which is controversial, but that I always give. So I'm going to say a lot of things now that are going to sound like conspiracy theory of how Robert Mugabe's government and even now Idi Mangada's government haven't been able to deliver, not because entirely of their own flaws, but because, first of all, because of this flawed concept which we call democracy and other things that are beyond their control. So, for example, ZANU, it was ZANU at the time, not ZANU-PF, comes into power April 18 of 1980, right? So immediately after they come into power, 2 years, there is a huge dispute between former ZIPRA cadres and the ZANU-PF government, because these guys were disgruntled because they said this is not what we agreed upon when we took our country. And then there is a dissident situation in Zimbabwe, which was not handled very professionally, I'm afraid. It is known by Gukurahundi, and it's a very sensitive issue here in Zimbabwe. So Gukurahundi drags on for about 5 years. It ends officially in 1987 on the 22nd of June when the then ZAPU president, Joshua Mqabu Nkomo, and the then president of ZANU and president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, come together and they make a unity accord. So all the socialist promises that Robert Mugabe's government had promised that they would deliver after independence, they weren't able to deliver. They only had 2 years. And then after that, they had 5 years of a civil war, a very terrible civil war, which is estimated to have killed 20,000 people. And then the problem is right after Bukurawundi ends, in 1987, the people from which they were taking their ideology, because I want to say this because ideology is important, as Catherine has also alluded to. Something happens to them. Mikhail Gorbachev had taken over in the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic, and he had sold out to capitalism and gotten into bed with the West. So officially, the USSR starts to collapse in 1987. And for record and historical purposes, it then finally ended in 1991. And then this is when we have separated the countries, standalone countries now like Crimea, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia. But the problem is that this is where we're getting the vast majority of our ideology. We have a KGB trained cadres, right? The current president of Russia, actually Vladimir Putin, once came to Africa he came to Africa to train some of our cadres that actually fought in the war of liberation. So why this was a problem? This is where democracy is a problem, but we didn't have a multi-party democracy. Why this is a problem is because when the USSR was disintegrated in 1991, it coincided, and this wasn't a coincidence, with our government getting a loan from the IMF through what they called, which then led to what they called the Economic Structural Adjustment Program, ESAP, which was 1991 to 1995. So capitalism is starting to creep in. As capitalism is starting to creep in, Zimbabwe now is in debt and it has to pay the IMF, but they don't have the money to pay the IMF, so they start to be given like all sorts of like capitalist policies, like start cutting on social spending, start raising your taxes, and then obviously the working class and their children who are university students get disgruntled, and then ZINASU starts to gain traction. The Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions starts to gain traction. In 1997, they have like this huge congress, which then led to the birth of the MDC in 99. So Robert Mugabe's government is now in 99. It hasn't had enough time to actually deliver on its promises. When Morgan Tsvangirai and his party decided that they can't defeat ZANU-PF because of the populist land reform program, they then get into bed with the West. And then from then on, everything that might have been democracy or a multi-party democracy goes to hell completely in Zimbabwe. Because these are guys that now take a lot of their instructions from the United States. Most people think that this is a conspiracy theory, but these are things that if you actually look into them, they are true. Before I go on with this point, I want to then recommend the listeners to go and read these 2 books from Noam Chomsky. One which says Profit Over People, and the other called How the World Works. And then also read Democracy, America's Biggest Export, the truth about US foreign policy and everything else by William Blum. So anyway, this is basically what starts happening in Zimbabwe. The democracy is prescribed. You have a lot of civic organizations and non-governmental organizations, including trade unions, like having a lot of interference from the United States. It's not democracy when you use institutions of democracy to then push your agenda. It's basically almost like a one-party state, except that the party is alien to the country. When you use CSO, which are supposed to be institutions of democracy, to push a capitalist agenda, because the Cold War did not end. Like realistically, like I said, when it ended in 91, it's for historical purposes, but capitalism kept on going forward. We know this because between 1990 and 1992, 3 African countries took on ISAP. The Ivory Coast in 1990, Zimbabwe in 1991, and Zambia in 1992. So because we want to push capitalist agendas, we use institutions of democracy to then make sure that you are stamping out socialism completely. That is not democracy. That is not some one party, one ideology thing which you're prescribing to us, to our detriment anyway. So this is basically most of what we call democracy and democratic institutions in Zimbabwe. They don't have ideology, like Christine was saying. They don't know where they want to go. It's not just about keeping the governments in check or keeping them accountable. It's about them being instruments and vehicles of neoliberalism and capitalism as a way to try and stamp out socialism, which the average person unfortunately cannot see. Which is the reason why I think Africa does not need this democracy, because it's prescribed. Africa needs a system of its own We can create this. If you have people creating the European Union, obviously, for economic reasons, right? If you have Asian countries creating whatever it is that they've created, why can't African countries, there's not a lot of us, there's just about 53, 54 of us. Why can't then African states not come together and do the same thing? So I feel like we don't need this prescribed democracy because it's a war. It's a war against socialism. It's a war against everything that Africa generally stands for. It's a war against all of what we have. It's not exactly democracy. It's neoliberalism being forced down our throats, but then being sugar-coated and being hidden under the term democracy and under institutions, which we call institutions of democracy. But a lot of CSOs in Africa are not CSOs per se. They're just vehicles of neoliberalism. But I also finally want to comment on why I'm speaking about this and using Zimbabwe as an example. Zimbabwe is not and was not and will probably won't be just any other African state. Robert Mugabe is one of them, like widely respected and known Pan-Africanists and founding fathers of independent African states. He was a larger-than-life character, a man even knighted by the Queen of England at the time because people thought he would fall in their hands. He's the kind of person that had vast influence over other African states. He was well respected. So when they prove that socialism is terrible because look at Robert Mugabe is failing in Zimbabwe, it would be easier to convince every other African state that do not be socialist, please be capitalist, please be neoliberalist. So the idea was then to make sure that the Zimbabwean economy, which was a modern economy, crashes under a respected person, under like a larger-than-life character. The same thing that they did with the USSR. They made sure that the USSR falls so that people in the West, people in the Middle East actually believe that socialism can't work, socialism is terrible, economies will fall under socialism, which is not exactly true, which is why they made sure that they fought and fought and fought until they disintegrated the USSR. This is the same thing that happened to Zimbabwe and Robert Mugabe. People were fighting day and night to make sure that Zimbabwe failed, to make sure that whatever Robert Mugabe says is not taken seriously, to make sure that they make an example of Zimbabwe and how socialism doesn't work. So the opposite of socialism for them is neoliberalism, which they then termed democracy. Everything that is called democracy is not in fact democracy in the strict sense of the word. It's not governance of the people, by the people, and for the people. It is neoliberalist doctrines that tell you about free market, more civil rights, and that governments should have very little intervention into like what corporates do and what large corporates do. It's basically just rich people and their corporates wanting to be rich and richer while poor people become poorer and poorer. And yet these are the poor people that are basically laboring for them and making their wealth. So democracy is not democracy. The democracy prescribed by the United States is neoliberalist doctrines. So they will tell you that it's democracy, but it's not. It's neoliberalism. And they'll tell you that socialism is anti-democratic. So as a result, I don't want to defend African government. When you're fighting a war like that as a result, and when your people that you are leading being made to believe that neoliberalism is actually democracy, and your vehicle, which we call institutions of democracy when they're actually not, in your country trying to cause regime change. I love this term because most ruling parties love it. You are forced sometimes to do drastic things, which I'm not going to condone or excuse. But which is at the end of the day, when you find that political parties are cornered, ruling parties are cornered, they end up doing all sorts of terrible, terrible things, gross human rights violations. So we can't condone this. We end up having people being beaten up or arrested to be silent. You have people disappearing, all of which would not have happened if someone wasn't trying to force things down our throats and to try and dislodge governments because they're socialist ideology. So we need something of our own, which we don't copy from other people. And I can tell you that I am convinced that if we create something of our own, a system of our own, and we generally don't have to have more wars, because the war won't stop with neoliberalism. But if we then like disregard these guys from the West, we have less human rights violations. We have less because we have political parties that have ideologies, but that are not necessarily cornered. So in my opinion, and to conclude, I think that the democracy that is being prescribed to the world by the United States is terrible. It is not democracy. It is something terrible which they are hiding behind the term democracy. And this whole, I think it's a farce that we have institutions that we've been calling institutions of democracy. Those are agents of regime change. I agree with Robert Mugabe 100% on this. I agree with Muammar Gaddafi 100% on this. I agree with Julius Nyerere, Thomas Sankara 100% on this. I think it's high time that we're the United States of Africa, our own thing, that democracy is a job.
Wow. Wow. That's just brilliant. Thank you so much for saying that. And I think we do have a shared view, the three of us, that this concept of democracy does not work. I mean, if there was ever a time to give an indication to the whole world that American doctrines, most of them are a bit flawed, was when Biden was voted into power, and there were a lot of disturbances because Donald Trump he was not willing to step up. It's something that's very common in African countries, and it's something that we were not expecting in quote unquote a first world country, the forefathers and founding fathers of democracy, which is obviously neoliberalism. In the interest of time, sorry guys, I will just have to ask us to end this conversation now. But I am going to propose that we actually do have a part 2 discussion that's purely based on this whole concept of democracy, because there are a lot of questions that I do have now, and I'm sure that our listeners do have the same questions. Because, Pan-Africanism, it's a very good concept. It's a very beautiful concept, and I think it works for us as African people. But for some reason, it has just been, most of these other respected leaders that we've had, one way or the other, their downfall has always been the most pitiful. You brought up Muammar Gaddafi, and we all know how it ended up, which was not what anybody expected. So we have got a narrative that tries to make us believe that our leaders are actually bad for us, and they don't have our interests at heart. And I think it's because of that narrative that we don't even appreciate some of the efforts that our governments end up making. So you'd find that right now we have constantly talked about the African Continental Free Trade Area on this platform, and how it's such a promising concept for Africa, how, that is going to boost economic development within the continent. But my fear, which is something that we've tried to really raise on this platform, has been this concept of outside interference. Because I genuinely feel that as long as Africa remains impoverished, there are a lot of people that are going to be happy. The West is going to be happy simply because they get to benefit quite a lot from the state that Africa is. So I think that we really need to sit down and talk about this. We might even want to reopen the discussion that we had, Prosper, where we spoke about Africa and receiving aid. Does Africa really need aid? We spoke about it here some time back, and we agreed that Africa does not need aid. And I think it comes back again to this whole concept that we've got a lot of narratives that are being shoved down our throats. And what makes it even hard, which is something that you have pointed out today, is the fact that these narratives are being pushed down the common person's throat, that we become so disgruntled and we lose faith, and we just, get to a point where we don't progress. Thank you for listening.